And it is tails. So Mark Danner will begin.
It's okay, I wasn't ready.
The timekeeper.
What was that?
Christopher might like to take a look at the coin.
Maybe after the debate.
I happen to know that it has Kim Il-sung on one side and Kim Jong-il on the other. Both heads. Orville sits in his office and says, "Dear leader, great leader, dear leader."
You're using your time up, Mark.
Thank you, Orville. And thank you to Berkeley, and especially to Richard Goldman for having this event tonight. As we've heard ad nauseum, it is frightfully timely. We have just been gathered around the television set back at Northgate Hall, seeing the President's State of the Union address, in which he, not too fortuitously, addressed our question: how should we use our power? Iraq and the War on Terror. He gave a speech, a very eloquent speech, I think, that was full of fear, and that answered to me what is really the underlying question there, which is, what kind of a country are we going to be, and on what basis will we act in the world? Will it be out of fear and distrust of the rest of the world, acting as a muscle-bound troll, secure in our power, flaunting it, blustering? Or will we act cooperatively, multilaterally, trying to make the world better? We live in interesting times. This is, to my mind, the third time in the last century that Americans have gathered together to address this question. The first time was 1919, after the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson urged the United States to join the League of Nations. He was defeated in that fight, killed him, as a matter of fact. The second was the late 40s, when those people we now know as the wise men, led by President Harry Truman, put together the world system that has led us through the Cold War: NATO, the Marshall Plan, the Western Alliance. We are at work on the same question today, and we're working on it in the shadow of an event that has terrified the country: 9/11, the attacks of 9/11. Since that time, President Bush, with great eloquence and great determination, has put forward a certain view of the world. It divides the world into good and into evil. The United States is here to defend the good and to keep out the forces of evil. He talked about them tonight as the forces of disorder and chaos. Those who are not with us are against us. The war in Iraq, or the proposed war in Iraq, which now apparently has a date, February 5th, or at least a date for its final launching, February 5th, has fit under this rubric. Saddam is an evil dictator. He is erratic. He has weapons of mass destruction. He will never disarm. There must be regime change. Regime change, I would suggest to you, is one of the most noxious euphemisms that American foreign policymakers and American politicians have yet devised. It belongs up there with surgical strike, for it suggests that the United States can change regimes in Iraq with all the difficulty and all the muss of changing a shirt. In fact, we're talking about attacking, bombing, invading, and occupying a major Arab country. During the speech tonight, there was not a word about occupation. My view during this debate, we'll have many different disagreements about military forces, about how risky this is, and indeed it's quite possible that this war will leave dead no more than those killed during the Gulf War of 1991. Certainly American military commanders would be very grateful to take that bet, to take that deal. In 1991, only 200 Americans died. According to the Defense Intelligence Agency, 100,000 Iraqis died. Almost all of those military, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 civilians. I'm going to say that again, 100,000. This is regime change. Now, the president tonight, did many of you see this speech, by the way, or were you waiting in line? Well, the president tonight cited weapons of mass destruction. He cited the risk of giving weapons to terrorism. He cited what I think is probably the underlying reason, which is a strategic one, that an unstable dictator would dominate the region of the Persian Gulf. I think we have to look during the days after 9/11. I'm going to give you, anyway, a few, pushing on my time, a few quotes from the councils of power in the days after 9/11. This is Donald Rumsfeld, courtesy of Bob Woodward, from September 25th, 2 weeks after 9/11. Look, as part of the war on terrorism, he said in a meeting, should we be getting something going in another area other than Afghanistan, so that success or failure and progress isn't measured just by Afghanistan? Condoleezza Rice, should they worry about launching military action elsewhere as an insurance policy in case things in Afghanistan went bad? They would need successes early in any war to maintain domestic and international support. The United States' rapid victory in the 1991 Gulf War and the immediacy of watching it unfold live on CNN had redefined people's expectations about warfare.
1 minute, Mark.
1 minute. The inspectors are spread out across Iraq. It is impossible now for it to develop further weapons of mass destruction. It is clear that the nuclear program has been dismantled. El-Baradei has already said that. The inspection regime can be strengthened with the addition of more inspectors, the imposition of smart sanctions directed narrowly toward any implements used toward making weapons of mass destruction. And the U.S. should declare a policy whereby it will feel free to strike from the air those facilities that it suspects are making nuclear weapons, if those are indeed found and inspectors are denied access. Iraq effectively is contained. The United States, Al-Qaeda cannot defeat the United States, 5,000 highly trained religious fanatics. But the United States can defeat the United States. It can defeat the United States by occupying a major Arab country, taking it over, and serving as a major recruitment sergeant for Al-Qaeda.
Time.
That went very fast.
Christopher Hitchens.
Mark's applause isn't part of my time, I hope. You want quick? I can give you quick. I've written some attacks on euphemism myself. Surgical strike is only the least of them. Collateral damage is obviously the ugliest and the silliest of those. But let me begin. We don't have an actual motion for debate tonight, but we have a topic. And I'd like to have a sense, if I may. I'll begin with a term that everybody knows, no-fly zone. That's the practice by which Anglo-American and formerly French aircraft prevent Saddam Hussein from operating against the Shia or the Kurds. May I invite a show of hands, who would lift those no-fly zones today if the vote was up to them? Okay, no one I can see. Thank you. No, this is all about pluralism. Okay, have a show of hands of anyone who thinks oil isn't worth fighting about. Slightly more. Oil isn't worth fighting about. That's more. Okay, now I know what I'm up against. The no-fly zones, I'll just ask one more question. Who knows whether those have UN authorization or not? They don't, in case you don't know. In other words, what I somehow feel I'm up against is the following. An illusion that is common in the Middle East among people who aren't entirely paranoid, and an illusion that is common also in Washington among some intellectuals who suffer from hubris. And this illusion is the following. It is the illusion that the United States has the power to decide these matters, rather than simply to influence them, that all power rests in the hands of Washington. Unfortunately, to correct the paranoids and perhaps also to redress the hubris of the neoconservative intellectuals. Such is not the case. What we were able to do is rather limited. But what we must recognize is that the war, or the engagement with Saddam Hussein's regime, has already begun. The policing of the no-fly zones is a declaration of war. It's a daily act of hostility. The Iraqi regime is within its legal right to try and bring those planes down and enable itself once again to fasten its rule upon Kurdistan and upon the south. But it's prevented from doing so by force. Meanwhile, in northern Iraq, the forces of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, who I choose as my side in this because I don't find anything particularly menacing in President Bush saying that sides must be chosen. I come from a tradition that asks, which side are you on in matters of principle and struggles of freedom, is at war with the bin Ladenist gang known as Ansar al-Islam, which operates, it seems, solely with the intention of destroying the independent Kurdish leadership and state. Why it should choose this as the first target of its bin Ladenist holy war, why it should choose to make war on the same enemy as Mr. Hussein has, I leave to you to determine, though I have a very good suspicion myself. There is no escaping this confrontation. There is no neutralist or abstentionist position to be taken. The only position that cannot be occupied is that of wait and see. We are already engaged. And in some ways I find myself exhilarated by this prospect because I don't know any Iraqi or Kurd who hasn't been waiting for many years for the day when the Saddam Hussein regime is completely dead and utterly buried. And we owe a duty to these people, having betrayed them and disappointed them so much in the past, having made promises that were not kept. We also owe a duty, it seems to me, to the 4 million Iraqis, that's 4 million out of 22 to 23 million, who are forced to live overseas in exile from their own country, terrified for their families, often with stories to tell, any one of which would chill the blood of anyone in this room. These 4 million people, qualified, educated, honest, hard-working, productive, it seems to me have the right of return. And it's a privilege to be able to say that one is on their side and able to hasten that day. It hasn't always been possible to say this in defense of the policy of the United States administration. Often one's had to choose between being a supporter of regime change and a supporter of the administration. I hope that that moment is now at an end. I'm willing to reopen hostilities with the administration if any division between these two objectives should open itself. But it does seem to me that by what might be called, perhaps, with not too much of a stretch, a Hegelian moment, I mean Hegel's famous phrase about the cunning of history, that by a long series of mistakes and crimes and blunders and other evolutions and accidents, the United States has placed itself or has emerged upon the right side of history in this region. And I hope I have time to give the 4 reasons, principal reasons, why I believe that to be true. The first reason I have, in a sense, already touched upon. There is a moral imperative for regime change in Iraq. Ever since the revolutions of 1989 that we thought would bring an end to the Cold War and the simultaneous terror of nuclear annihilation and the arms race, our hopes and our peace dividends that we were hoping for have been repeatedly spoiled, ruined, compromised, set at naught or set at risk by the revival of the remaining one-party state, megalomaniac, single-leader despotisms. Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein in his annexation of Kuwait, Kim Jong-il. We are not yet through with the discredited idea of the one-party state, the hysterical state of leader worship, militarism, the cult of uniforms for school children and party salutes, and all the aggression, chauvinism, hysteria, and filth that goes with that. But we will outlive,
1 minute.
I think, such regimes, and this will be one of the tests. Second, it's quite clear that the oil resources of the world do not belong to whoever is in charge in Iraq, and we have the right to say that the oil of the region should be declared as common property, and blood for oil was shed when Saddam Hussein was able to gas the Kurds at Halabja and have nothing said by the administration. That was blood for oil. It was also fascism for oil. That was when blood was shed for oil, when we stood by and preferred the stability of the regime to the matters of principle. On the weapons of mass destruction, I think I'm going to have to reserve my time. It looks as if I might even have to reserve it on international gangsterism and the support of the Iraqi regime for it, though both of these things are susceptible of very strenuous and exhaustive proof. My closing appeal will be this.
It better be
Do not
quick because
ask
your
yourself-
time is up.
Do not ask yourselves how others will vote in this or at the United Nations. Ask how you yourselves would vote if the casting vote was to be your own. That's the sense of we in this meeting. Thank you.
Before we move into the rebuttals, I want to admonish all of you in the audience to please hold your own comments. This debate is being held in the tradition of free speech, and I ask you to respect that.
No, if I may say so, Orville, I don't seek protection from people who make animal noises.
Well,
It's perfectly okay by me. I have a broad back.
we would rather
I'd prefer they do it later with Christopher then.
Very well.
save your animal noises till after the debate. We now move to 7-minute rebuttals from each of you.
Well, I feel like I'm debating Hegel a bit. Because though Christopher's address was a stirring one, I'm not sure what the reasons are that were stated for attacking, invading, and occupying Iraq. First, the war has already begun. That is, the no-fly zones are in existence and they're being patrolled every day. I would think that would be a reason to say one needn't invade. The Kurds are being safeguarded. Air defenses are being destroyed when they threaten alliance planes. And in fact, Iraq, however much we talk about an aggressive dictator, is being effectively contained. Which side are you on? You have to choose, and there's no escaping this confrontation. I would agree with that. I think one does have to choose. I think the question is whether you believe the United States can now protect itself by occupying a major Middle Eastern country. And I phrase that specifically that way. I'm very, Christopher and I have spent, I guess, our adult lives thinking about this question. How should we use our power? I've written about Central America, Haiti, in which we backed for many, many years a horrible dictator, then helped him into exile, then made possible a democratic election in which Father Aristide was elected, then stood by the United States while he was overthrown in a coup, then returned him to power with an invasion and occupation, and then essentially let the country drift into, as Bush would say tonight, chaos and disorder. I've learned to suspect dreaming imperial dreams. I've learned to suspect United States American language, which comes very natural to Americans, about freedom, liberation, and making the world safe. It's language that is very effective, which is why American presidents use it. But I think of American foreign policy as a spotlight, pointed here, pointed there. For a few brief moments, we learn about a country, we learn everything there is to know about it, we read in the papers, and then the spotlight moves on. And in the darkness, you find ruins, you find destruction, you find death. It's happened again and again over the Cold War and indeed the post-Cold War era. So I suspect the sentiment that everybody must choose and that we owe indeed a duty to these people. I think our duty, first of all, is to Americans. First of all, to Americans. And I think the idea that we can spread democracy throughout the Arab world by attacking, invading, and occupying Iraq is a fantasy. I think it is true that there are many, or at least some in the administration who believe this. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, one could name others, Richard Pearl. It is unclear how much power they have. It is unclear, finally, whether their views will hold and whether, indeed, an occupation will stretch long enough and be firm enough and have sufficient soldiers to bring some kind of new stability to Iraq based on some kind of democratic order. given the sectarian differences in the country, given the history of minority regimes, given that the only nationwide institutions in Iraq are the army and the secret police, which, by the way, are Sunni-dominated, minority-dominated, that is. So to establish a democratic system there is going to be extremely, extremely difficult, and it's going to take a great deal of sacrifice and dedication and money. Let us say these people do prevail within the councils of the administration, that the occupation continues for 10 years. The question to me then becomes whether the political difficulties of doing this, whether the fights for power within Iraq, whether the attacks on American troops, whether the political struggles over retribution to get the torturers out of the government and out of public life, the political struggles between the exiles, who Christopher so eloquently described, and those struggling for power within the country, whether those can possibly be contained by an American occupation regime without indeed causing enormous political difficulties throughout the Middle East. Although the administration argues some days that democratization will spread like dominoes through the Middle East, and where have we heard that before? Though it says this, it's much more likely, I think, after an American attack and occupation, that autocratic control and repression will be strengthened among Iraq's neighbors, even those that are taking tentative steps toward liberalization. Why? Because you'll have anti-American demonstrations, you'll have anti-American speeches, you'll have large gatherings in the street opposing military action against Iraq, and these regimes, who are very delicate, will be inclined, as they almost always are, to attack vigorously to suppress them. It would be nice to know a little bit more clearly what the administration has planned for the occupation of Iraq. The president has been absolutely studious in not talking about the occupation. I have to return finally to the point about al-Qaeda. What was al-Qaeda trying to do when it attacked those buildings on September 11th? We've been so full, made so full of theological language about good and evil that we can't see a very basic question in front of our face. What were they after? They were after, I'm sorry, is it 1 minute? They were after a reaction, an overreaction on the part of the United States. They hoped the United States would come into Afghanistan and kill tens of thousands of civilians. They are after a rising en masse in the Arab world. They are trying to build a political movement in support of Islamist regimes throughout the Arab world, notably in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. There is nothing we could do. As I said, the al-Qaeda, though the president has talked about that they want to destroy us, al-Qaeda cannot destroy the United States. The United States can walk into a trap that al-Qaeda has set for it and destroy itself politically throughout the Middle East, creating havoc where none existed before. And I'd like to hear the answer to those questions.
I bet you would.
Christopher Hitchens, 7 minutes rebuttal.
Well, you tempt me to reply by saying where none existed before, but that might be a low blow of a reply. I think I've got I've got time to focus on 2 points.
Strike where you like.
Remember, you said it first. I've got time to focus on 2 points. One is the one about regime change and occupation. I opened with the question of the no-fly zones and the Kurdish autonomous area for another reason, which is as follows. Since 1991, in other words, for a little more than 10 years, we know what regime change would look like in Iraq. We can't know everything in advance, any more than the people who urge caution upon us can be sure that their policy would not lead, as it has so far, to calamity. But we can know this. In the most difficult and dangerous and mountainous terrain of northern Iraq, the one most marked by tribalism and clan struggle in the past, and by other kinds of faction, in the area that had been the most cleansed, bombarded, persecuted, and impoverished of the entire country, in that northern sixth of Iraq, we have now 21 newspapers, I think it is, in Erbil, a parliament, several parties, 4 female judges, and the most recent parliamentary debate was on whether or not to abolish capital punishment, even though they hold a number of bin Ladenist prisoners recently caught while attempting to kill the elected leadership of this area. Well, furthermore, internet cafes, free exchange of goods, trade, movement, and so forth, and a certain amount of prosperity to go with. Those of us who talk about regime change, in other words, are not sucking this out of our thumbs. We're not being utopian. The ones who are being utopian are those who believe that by any combination of forces, regime preservation can go on any longer in Iraq. That is the truly idealistic and illusory position. On this matter of containment, therefore, bear in mind, and of realism, self-preservation, survival, deterrence, and the rest of it, bear in mind the following. When he was retreating from Kuwait, when he was giving up his invasion, occupation, and massacre of that country, Saddam Hussein gave the order that its oil fields should be blown up, should be ignited, when he had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and when he had been warned very solemnly by the then Bush administration of dire consequences should he do anything so vandalistic. Nonetheless, he did so. He's continued ever since to risk his own life on a proposition that's now been repeatedly and demonstrably exposed, the idea that he can both stay in power and develop weapons of mass destruction. Clearly, this course of insanity means a great deal to him, and it cannot really be said that a man who's self-evidently now approaching his Ceausescu moment of political and moral and personal and political breakdown is a safe bet. This contingency, the implosion of his regime, is a certainty. That will happen anyway. And it will deliver to the international community an impoverished, terrified, long isolated, and sectarian Iraq. That's in our future too. What then is the course of prudence and caution, so often urged upon us by those who like to employ such terms as if only they understood them? The course of prudence and caution is clearly to be ready with as large a force as may be needful, military, medical, political, with nutrition, with good news, and with every other kind of facility and resource, to begin the long process of the rehabilitation of Iraq, the reconstitution of its oil industry, and the rehabilitation of its much damaged people. This will be a task that will fall upon the international community in any case. I think the United States administration is to be congratulated for deciding to prepare to undertake this before it will be needed. And bear in mind that no one else could do it, even if the United Nations was to vote unanimously and urgently that it be done at once. It would still be to Washington that they would direct that request. Now, on the matter of will we upset people if we resist them? I've heard this before. I remember being told a few years ago, not that many years ago, less than 2 years ago, if you kill Osama bin Laden, thousands more bin Ladens will arise in his place. I thought not myself. He looks like a one-of-a-kind guy to me, as does Saddam Hussein in many other ways. But I would add, suppose it to be true, though it is not true, if he's not dead, as I believe him to be, he's certainly very much in hiding. If people rise up to take his place, they'll be killed as well. Of that I can absolutely assure you. And there are more of us than there are of them, and we are smarter and cleverer and more tolerant, and we too have unalterable convictions, and we too believe that our culture and civilization mustn't be offended, defamed, raped, and defiled. And we will fight for that. Do you remember? Now there's the question now, Mark Janner suggested that what Osama bin Laden got, the total destruction of the regime that sheltered him, forgotten now in Afghanistan to the point where it's inconceivable that it could come back. The return of 1.5 million Afghans to Afghan soil, a population explosion of liberated Afghans returning, the utter destruction of the al-Qaeda network in the country, the scattering of it across other territories, the constant harassing pursuit. What he got, and that's what he did get, is what he wanted. He said, you're playing into my hands by doing that. I do not think so. And how, in any case, are we to predict what will offend these people? Has anybody read the al-Qaeda communique, for example, hailing the murder of Australian holidaymakers in the island of Bali recently? Has anyone read the al-Qaeda communique praising and justifying that? I'm sorry that no one seems to be putting up their hand. It's worth reading. What is the reason that it gives? Why must young Australians be burned alive as they're having a dance and a smooch.
1 minute.
Why? Because Australian troops took part in the independence process that separated East Timor from Indonesia. Not everyone could have guessed that or seen that coming. But I could have done and did. Osama bin Laden has repeatedly claimed that East Timor has no right to independence because its people are Christian. And Indonesia, remember, is Muslim and should be under the caliphate. So anyone, even belatedly like Australia, who helps the martyred people of East Timor, I use the word martyrdom metaphorically, not fanatically, must therefore expect to be killed. Such is self-evident. Now, I think I have to therefore leave Mark with two possibilities. One, well, knowing they were going to behave like that about it, we should probably have left these Timorese under Indonesian rule. Not a contingency that I hope recommends itself. Or second, we should ask ourselves all the time what they think of us. I think the time has come, after they've dived planes into my hometown and other people's hometown too, to make sure that they wonder first, last, and all the time what we think of them, and to make sure that we do not reply in kind, but that our reply cannot be mistaken for cowardice or stupidity.
Time.
Thank you.
Now we go to 5 minutes final reply by each of you before an open discussion. Mark Danner?
I have to think there's a species of child psychology going on here. Perhaps
Okay,
I'm wrong.
This had better be good.
We had better not think when we act what Osama bin Laden wants, because if we do, we are doing his bidding and we're afraid of him. My proposition is that we shouldn't do what Osama bin Laden wants because it's stupid. We should act in the best interests of our country. The best interests of our country would lead us to act in a way that will not bring more terrorism to our shores. It would encourage us to act in a way in which, by occupying an Arab country, we do not shift the political winds decisively against us in the Middle East and put allied regimes under great stress. It would encourage us to do what we need to do to fight the war on terror without buying into and participating in the political program launched by Osama bin Laden perhaps a decade ago. Christopher talked about Afghanistan and what a thumping we delivered there. Al-Qaeda and Osama is thought to be hiding out either somewhere in Afghanistan or in Pakistan, our great ally. He also seems very willing to, when Osama bin Laden says, I want to launch a war of civilizations against the West, and thereby put in power fundamentalist regimes that will overthrow those that support the West, like those in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Christopher seems to want to say, fine, bring it on. War of civilizations? Absolutely. I'm not afraid.
Yeah.
Indeed.
If they want one, they can have one.
I can only repeat that it seems to me what we are talking about here is intelligent action. To act in the best interests of the country, to act to protect Americans. You know, Iraq now, despite the picture that President Bush drew of it tonight, is a country that is semi-occupied in the south, semi-occupied in the north, with no-fly zones from the west. It is covered with inspectors, with more on the way. The nuclear development program has been fairly decisively declared to be dead. It's true the gas and biological weapons have not all turned up, but I believe that they will, if given sufficient amount of time. There will not be an aggressive attack from Iraq. Iraq is contained, and there are things that we can do with the United Nations and with our allies to make that containment more secure. What can we do? More inspectors, more helicopters, more inspections, and even more vigorous inspection regime that is open-ended, as, by the way, this one is. Smart sanctions focused on military equipment. No sanctions more on anything that can be construed as humanitarian, which will solve political problems for us, among other things, in the Middle East. Third, a declaratory policy that sites that are not made available to inspectors will be attacked from the air. Finally, a war crimes tribunal modeled on that of The Hague and Arusha on Rwanda, connected with the United Nations, that would bring to bear dossiers on the leading Iraqi leaders, thus putting political pressure on those leaders toward regime change, as we called it, but regime change from within the country. In that war crimes tribunal, it will be quite clear that those who cooperate with the tribunal in accomplishing regime change will have that taken into account by the tribunal. There are ways to devise policies to deal with this country. It is reduced, its army is half the size as it was a decade ago. Its nuclear weapons program has been dismantled. Why do something that will essentially cost a lot of lives and leave us occupying Iraq? Why do we want to occupy Iraq? If a year and a half ago, on 9/11, you said, well, the next thing we should do after these religious fanatics attack the United States is go into the Middle East and occupy a country of 23 million for an unlimited amount of time, it would have seemed bizarre. It still should.
No. There's nothing ironic in my applause for Comrade Danner here, because if you followed him closely, as I expect that you did, he said that each succeeding stage of intervention in Iraq was better than the last. Look at what we've accomplished with intervention. The Kurds are protected in the north, the Shia are prevented in the south. It doesn't look like they can rebuild their nuclear reactors. It doesn't look as if they want to be doing very much more exporting of terrorism. Other weapons of mass destruction have been downgraded. Every successive stage of intervention on the side of regime change in Iraq has been better than the last. That's what I've been saying all evening. I'm only arguing that this should be completed. And I'm saying that because, well, how hard is that? And I wonder who wishes it hadn't been completed in 1991, when it could and should have been. Well, the arguments against it, thank you. Please hold your applause, it's out of my time. The arguments against it were two. One of them was good, the other was bad. The argument the Bush administration, supported by particularly Mr. Powell, Mr. Armitage, and some others, the only person who's changed his mind on it since is Vice President Cheney, said, well, we didn't have a mandate to do anything except reconstitute Kuwait as a member state of the United Nations. Fine. Those who say that Republicans are hungry for war, conquest, and the rest of it should bear that in mind. We were mandated by the UN to liberate Kuwait. We can't go any further. Good. However, I think there was also a bad reason. They hoped that having been taught a lesson, Saddam Hussein would become again what he had previously been, a loyal client of the United States and a reasonable poodle, someone who understood who was boss. That's why I mentioned Halabja again, ladies and gentlemen, that was blood for oil. Why has there been no indictment of Saddam Hussein for genocide? The Genocide Convention, by the way, mandates immediate action by member states without further consultation on warning of genocide, both to punish and prevent. Why not? Because if the indictment was brought, it would be found that Saddam Hussein's most genocidal crimes were committed when he was an ally of Washington, D.C. And that can't be faced. But that was blood for oil, and that's when you should have put your silly placards up. Now, we have the chance now, and didn't, and still don't. As far as I can see, the anti-war movement acts as if the fate of the Kurdish people is a matter of indifference. Well, it's too late for that now. Anyone can see that a crisis crunch moment is occurring. Now, remember what I said about what Saddam did on his way out of Kuwait. See what he does now with the sanctions that only punish his people and not him. Who wants to prolong them another day? Only those who say give the inspectors more time are protracting the sanctions. The sanctions can go the minute the regime goes. Only two things can change: the sanctions or the regime. They're the only two variables. Lift the sanctions, and you increase what's already happening. 10% of every trade in and out of Iraq is taken by the Ba'ath Party and its clientele. What do you think they want the money for? I can tell you, you already know what they're using it for. To re-equip for another war. That's what they're using it for. What is their past record? One of being irrationally vicious and dangerous, even at moments when it couldn't really hope to do them any good. Now, that seems to me to complete the case for finishing a job that's already 12 years out of date. I would prefer to say, by the way, that this is a war not between civilizations, but for civilization. We know very well that in the Arab and Muslim world there are innumerable allies of pluralism, of free expression, of democracy, and many more potential ones. It's just a matter of deciding who is going to win the civil war within the Arab and Muslim world that has begun and that has now, and been going on a long time, and that has now tried to engulf our own society. Read the speeches of bin Laden. It's my final reply to Mark, my second point. Read the speeches of bin Laden and what he wants and what he thinks. They're very interesting. His sermons are well worth study. Condoleezza Rice, in my view, should have been fired for saying that they shouldn't be broadcast on American TV. Bin Laden in his statements has said the following repeatedly to his followers. He said, "For us, the defeat of the Red Army in Afghanistan and the bringing down of the Soviet Union was hard. That was a tough war, a bitter war, a long struggle, a heroic but arduous one. The second stage, the destruction of the United States, that will be easy. These people do not want to fight. They're fat, they're lazy, they're corrupt. They are run by the Jews. They think only of money." A great deal, it seems to me, depends on the number of ways, the variety of ways in which that hateful statement can and will be disproved and discredited. But make no mistake, the illusion here is on the side of our enemies, and that is to our advantage.
All right, now we move to a more free-form segment. Perhaps we'll start this 15 minutes with each of you posing a question to the other, and then you can just discuss as you will. Unless Mark, you would like to lead off.
What?
I'd give this to the audience.
Oh, I don't know. Let's go for a minute.
Okay, all right.
I don't know that I'd pose a question.
I was ready to answer rather than pose questions, I must say, and I think that that's what people have come for, but if you insist.
I would ask you to keep your comments reasonably short so you can allow some interchange between you. But lead off. This is the free-form hour here, quarter hour.
We have to be spontaneous.
I've been practicing being spontaneous all day. Much of the gravamen of Christopher's very eloquent remarks have been directly on the point. 2 points. Saddam Hussein is bad. Osama bin Laden is bad. I am going to save us a lot of time by conceding those points and save him a lot of time as well. I agree with those things. They are bad. The question we're debating today is whether it is wise to go to war in the Persian Gulf and to occupy Iraq. That is the question. The question is how to deal with this bad man, and it is a terrible regime. I'm startled to hear, and Christopher has repeated it a number of times recently, that the regime is imploding, that implosion is absolutely definite. It is about to happen. I'm not sure quite what this means. It may be, it strikes me a little like a policeman, batting somebody over the head until they bleed and then arresting them for littering. Indeed, the regime is imploding, he says. I have never seen or not seen any evidence of that, and I don't know anyone else who argues it. If indeed it's true, and if the regime is imploding because of inspectors all over the country, because of no-fly zones in the north and south, because of diplomatic pressure, then I believe indeed we should let the regime implode and let someone else take power. What I object to is the necessity of invading and occupying the country and constructing a new Iraq. Christopher has been eloquent in describing the sorry history of 1991, when U.S. troops stood by and essentially watched Saddam Hussein massacre tens of thousands of Shia in the south and Kurds in the north using his helicopters. U.S. troops were there. They could have intervened. Indeed, General Schwarzkopf could simply have said, stop, and they would have had to stop. It's possible that that uprising could have succeeded. Why did the U.S. not act then? Where has this recent absolute obsession with democracy come from? I would argue that our intentions in Iraq, though as I've tried to suggest, the regime or the administration is split over this, but our bottommost intentions in Iraq are strategic ones. We don't like this man. He's an unreliable dictator, and we would simply like to replace him with as little bloodshed as possible. They don't have to do with making a new world in the Middle East. They don't have to do with democracy. They have to do with power, strategic power. And I think once you reduce the argument to that level, and I tried to quote a few remarks after 9/11 from Rumsfeld and others that I think confirms it, once you concede that these are the interests, you can argue it on those terms. And on those terms, I can tell you that this seems to me a very futile and possibly self-defeating thing to do politically, particularly since the regime can be handled by a strong containment regime that is already half in place and that can be constructed with the help of the United Nations and our allies.
All right, let's get a response here from Hitchens.
Well, look, I think for the first point, I would say, if I was an Iraqi or a Kurd sitting in this hall, and I dare say there are some, I might be a little nettled by the way that people talk about me as if I wasn't there. The suggestion is that if these people were able to rule themselves or had the right to determine their own future, there would be chaos and inconvenience and so forth, or that they might need a permanent occupation. It seems to me that there's no evident ground for either of those assertions. I repeat, in the most difficult and dangerous and mountainous area of the country, there is self-government by the Kurds. It's not under occupation. It could very well be that the additional decade of misery, 12 years of misery and shame and bankruptcy and murder and terror that's been inflicted on the remainder of the country will require some kind of guardianship, stewardship, trusteeship, I don't want to say mandate, but you know what I mean, in order for the repair of the society to begin, for the refugees to be allowed to return and resume work, and for the oil industry, which is now working on 20-year-old equipment, to start pumping. And when that day begins, ladies and gentlemen, when that Iraqi pumping starts again, and when they can call their oil their own, and when the oil isn't being used for the financing of a parasitic, sadomasochistic Caligula and his system, another good thing will happen. The Saudi Arabian oil monopoly in the region will be broken forever. Is there anyone who doesn't look forward to that day? Or to being able to speak to the Saudis in the language that the administration should already be and have been employing to them. Some aims of regime change can't be publicly avowed by Republicans, but that doesn't mean they can't be publicly avowed by me. I hereby do so. Now, the word inspection is a ridiculous word in this context. The word really for what the 110 or so people on the Blix team is doing is a verification effort. There is no provision by any international agency for anything more than the verification of compliance. That means you go and you look, how many rods and so on and lasers did you have last time? Is the inventory still there? We'll need to check again and double count and so on, and if there's a discrepancy, we'll need to have it accounted for. To inspect a country the size of Iraq, you would need a regime change. You'd need to be the government of Iraq in order to verify what's happening at every site, and that seems to me perfectly self-evident. Furthermore, Kofi Annan, who's not the sap that some people take him for, but is certainly not a hawk, did want to reappoint Rolf Ekéus, the very distinguished Swede, and great international diplomat and civil servant, who conducted the inspections under condition, I might add, of a military occupation, which was all that made them possible, in 1991, and verified and blew up more weapons of mass destruction than had been destroyed in the war. And so Kofi Annan said, okay, if we're going to have inspections, we want Rolf Ekéus back as the inspector. I nominate him. Vetoed. Vetoed by France, vetoed by Russia. Vetoed by delegations made up of the clientele of Saddam Hussein's oil industry. In favor of Hans Blix, a man with a proven record of failure, who certified Iraq as exemplary in its compliance all through the 80s and 90s, and certified North Korea for good measure. Ladies and gentlemen, come on, this is Berkeley. We don't have to take anything at face value.
Mark?
It's a scandal, and I would add that for either France or Russia, faced with a 15-0 resolution that says this resolution stands until or unless it is materially breached, to threaten by any one vote to nullify it, to negate that resolution, is to be unilateralist. And I'll be very glad the first day I see the word unilateralist in the same sentence as France or Russia in the New York Times. Jacques Chirac, a man, I'll just say this, I think it's in Flaubert's Éducation Sentimentale. There's a banker, I think his name is Monsieur d'Alembert. At any rate, it is said of him by Flaubert, a man so corrupt that he would happily have paid for the pleasure of selling himself. Jacques Chirac had to run for re-election.
All right, Mr.
In order to
Hitchens,
stay out of jail for corruption, which included bribes from Iraq.
Let's remember this is the interactive
is unilateralism,
session.
and it should be opposed by American internationalism. Thank you.
All right.
As I sat here watching, wondering forlornly when I would be able to speak, I thought, yes, Flaubert, Madame Bovary, c'est moi.
Well, she had other forms of consolation.
She did indeed. And I'm alone on the stage, alas. Look, one can ridicule the inspection regime all one wants, and the UN is an absolutely fine thing to throw brickbats at. It's an old profession. The fact is that this inspection regime eliminated their nuclear weapons programs during the 90s, and no one is arguing that that did not work.
Under condition of occupation.
Christopher May in a moment.
Under condition of military defeat and occupation.
The fact is that indeed, it did work. And the question is, what indeed are we trying to accomplish in Iraq? And we've heard a lot about how bad Saddam Hussein is. I've conceded this is true. The question is this what this is about? Do we want to invade to remove a bad man who we don't like? Or is it about a threat to Americans, a threat to American interest? If it's about a threat, which is what the administration has said again and again, harping on the issue of weapons of mass destruction, then that threat can be dealt with short of all of the risks of occupation, of invasion and occupation. That is the truth. So we can ridicule inspections all we like, we can ridicule the United Nations. You know, at bottom, this debate today is about how should we use our power. We don't like this man, we want to remake the Persian Gulf, we go in, we invade, we do it with military force. If people don't like it, notably most of the rest of the world, then we say the hell with you. And we think that we have enough power in the future, a preponderance of power, that we won't necessarily need allies again. We can do these things by ourselves. That is the question that we're deciding here today about Iraq, how we act in the world. We haven't brought up...
Well, let's get a response to that.
Well, let me make one last point, if I might. You know, the idea of intervention and intervening to remove someone we dislike, there were a lot of officials in the early 70s who terribly disliked Salvador Allende. They felt it was their right to interfere and to remove him. They thought he was leading Chile to a state of destruction, that he was killing people in the streets, that Chile, as we know it, was going to be destroyed. They felt, to those who said he was democratically elected, they said, well, really only a third of Chileans voted for him.
All right, Mark,
and they acted to remove him.
Let's have a response.
Well, 100% of Iraqis voted for Saddam Hussein, so I don't see how they could possibly make that. And by the way, on 100% turnout as well. That's what I mean by Caligula. You have no idea what the texture of a regime of that kind is like till you've seen it. They were wrong about Allende, by the way. The charges they made were provably false. I've refuted them myself in my book on Henry Kissinger. This is flailing, Mark, I'm sorry to say. Nor, I appeal to you, comrades, nor did I ridicule the United Nations. I think I demonstrated some knowledge of its internal workings, including the debate within Annan's own staff on whether to reappoint.
My question
The only
is, when do you
serious
have the
inspector-
right to remove a
The
regime?
only serious inspector...
When do you have the right to
the only-
intervene?
I'm coming to that. The only serious inspector that Iraq has ever had, and the only serious inspection, not verification, inspection and demolition, which was only possible, I will remind you again, on condition of military defeat of Saddam Hussein and the physical presence in his country of international forces. Only under those conditions was that was an inspection, and it could be carried out. This is a verification only, and the President tonight didn't have time to itemize even the objections made by Blix in his report. Bush mentioned a number of the missing weapons dumps and warheads and so on, and unaccounted for stuff, and the insulting declaration by the Iraqis. He didn't get through all of what Blix managed to babble through. For example, that there is a U-2 plane at the service of the inspectors, the verifiers, and the Iraqi government won't allow it to fly. Suggestive, I think, and many other things. Anyone who believes that the Iraqi regime has not now demonstrated material breach of a unanimous Security Council resolution has all the explaining to do. Those of us who knew that this would happen and that Saddam Hussein never lets you down were right, and we will be proved even more right when his regime implodes and when we find the mass graves and the secret prisons and see what's under some of those palaces and under those mosques. And when we get the testimony of the victims and survivors, a lot of people who talk now and say no war with Iraq when they mean no quarrel with Saddam Hussein are going to look and I hope feel very foolish and perhaps worse.
Let's have a response.
The question is whether you want to, your aim is to disarm this regime, to disarm it, and to contain it, and to wait until it, as Christopher says, implodes, or do you want to use the inspections as an excuse to invade and occupy it? This has been the dichotomy from the beginning of this policy in the fall. Is the inspection regime serious about removing these weapons? Is that what it's about? Or is it about providing an excuse for the United States to attack, invade, and occupy Iraq? And Christopher suggests in his remarks that indeed it is about an excuse to attack, invade, and occupy Iraq. And the legalisms, he's willing to state all of these things. I mean, we can talk about Blix's report, who supported, he did support very strongly continuing the inspections, as did El-Baradei.
It's not his job. It's not his job to make that recommendation. He exceeds his brief. Mr. Blix is not obliged to give advice of this kind, of war or peace. He's obliged only to say
the
whether
point
Iraq
is
complies
that he
or not.
emphasized that they had access to the sites that they demanded. One gets in a position of simply arguing for the Iraqi regime, and I'm not here to do that.
I wouldn't do that if I was you.
I will not. I will not indeed. But the question again is, do you want to disarm him? I mean, are you taking this at face value, that you want to disarm this regime and take its claws out and take whatever threat that remains in it away through a multilateral process using our allies and their support? Or do you want to make war? And do you want to use the United Nations resolution as an excuse to make war? And indeed, the latter, I think, is true on Christopher's part, and that is a position. But I don't think one can really, in the end, base it on the United Nations process, because there is a process out there that will protect the United States from Saddam Hussein. It's working. And it's interesting that, the European allies, a lot of other countries do not feel the kind of threat that we seem to feel in Washington. They are a lot closer. They are a lot closer. So we're back again to the question of how do we use our power? How do we use our power? Do we say this man is bad, we're going to invade the country, occupy it to hell, launch the torpedoes, and we'll see. If the occupation's difficult, if the reconstruction's hard, well, we can get out of there, as we seem to have done partly in Afghanistan. Well, we'll create the damage, but in the end, we can leave. We can come back to our shores. Or do we address the issue that supposedly is threatening us, which is weapons of mass destruction? If that is the issue, we are able to do it. If the issue is bringing democracy to the Middle East, then we're talking about imperial dreams that we've been warned about again and again. John Quincy Adams, in a famous quote of mine, said, "Go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." Why not, he said? In the end, America might become the dictatress of the world she would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. In the end, this has to do with us, with our attitudes toward the world, with how we act in the world, and how we behave in it.
Okay, a short reply.
Well, I'd warmly second that, and I think it's a happy series of coincidences, as well as some very unhappy elements of history, that have brought the United States to the point where it is objectively, and now decisively, on the side of regime change in Iraq. I don't stipulate war, I don't stipulate invasion, I don't stipulate occupation. I stipulate the United States should be on the side of regime change in the region, and you know as well as I do, as well as everyone here does, there wouldn't be a single verifier or inspector in Iraq if it wasn't for the absolutely believable threat of force. Indeed, there wouldn't even be a resolution addressing Iraq's violation of all these codes, treaties, and resolutions. And I myself believe, and will state again, that Iraq's repeated defiance of all these resolutions on genocide, on human rights, on weapons, and on the respect of the borders of other countries, and the support for international terrorism, if allowed to continue, would be a far greater negation of the principles and the practice and the institution of the United Nations.
If you are not for war, but for regime change,
than any speech made by war, Mark, requires that two countries pit their armies against one another for indefinite combat. I'm willing to bet you now, and anyone else here who'll take my wager, there will be no such engagement in Iraq. There will be
we're
redefining
the words.
There will be, you said war, not I. I have used the word war all evening. There will be no war. There will be a fairly brief and ruthless military intervention to remove the Saddam Hussein regime, long overdue. Well,
Orwell would be proud of that construction.
I've already made myself I've made myself the hostage to anyone who wants to make that noise again a few weeks from now. So come and make it. By the way, if you knew how you sounded when you made it, you might make it less. Wait, just a second. Now,
I'm the challenge.
Determinative. I've been challenged here.
If implosion
I've been challenged here.
Is determinative and will happen no matter what we do, then why indeed need there be a ruthless, brief military intervention not defined as
Gentlemen,
war?
Please don't talk
If
together.
indeed implosion is about to happen...
Well, I can't answer the question if you keep asking it.
Yeah, Mark, I give you 30 seconds to ask the question, and you, Hitchens...
I have the question. I have the question. It's been asked repeatedly. I've said
30
again,
seconds to reply.
It would be treating very meanly by the Iraqi people and by their neighbors and by ourselves if we simply said, let's watch the place fall in on itself as the regime collapses and see what happens. Then you would get ethnic strife. Then you would get revenge killing. Then you would get a total social breakdown. And yes, you would tempt other countries neighboring or factions within them to intervene. That would be the most irresponsible outcome of all. And bear in mind, this is taking place on top of about 9% of the Earth's proven oil resources, and it's not a matter of indifference if someone with a dirty bomb or some other device decides to try and ignite them again. No, there should be an international readiness to intervene and place Iraq in a friendly internationalist trusteeship.
So the responsible thing is to invade.
Excuse me, my answer, you will notice, didn't mention the questions of weapons of mass destruction. That is only the basis on which the United States can approach, and I'm not a spokesman for this administration.
All right, gentlemen, I think
can approach the United Nations, but there are at least 4 reasons, all of which I gave. International support for international gangsterism,
Hitchens, I think
violation of the Genocide
we
Convention.
will not...
all of these are cases for regime change on their own. Taken together, they're overwhelming.
I think this debate needs a little stewardship of its own, and I'd like to exercise that now by moving to questions from you all in the audience. Is there a moral imperative, if there is a moral imperative for regime change in Iraq, is there a similar imperative for regime change in North Korea? Perhaps Hitchens would like to commence.
Well, North Korea is the only place that I've been. I'm quite well up on my axis, by the way. That is worse than Iraq. In North Korea, levels of horror occur that Saddam Hussein can only dream of. The citizen is entirely the property of the state, and the entire state and society is organized permanently for war. And of course, it's also true that this party state and its fantasy leader will too face and suffer the condemnation of history and will collapse, but under circumstances that might not be favorable to us if we couldn't help to shape them. The difference in this case is that we are not able to influence this outcome militarily. That's for a simple reason that I think now most people get. I've been to the DMZ that divides Korea, the demilitarized zone, one of the nastiest places on earth. I've also been right up close to it from both sides. I've seen it from both ends. And it's only something like a 40-minute drive from the capital city of South Korea, Seoul, which is now, after a long and honorable struggle in which I was proud to play some part, the capital of a thriving democracy. It's within range of an extraordinary number of North Korean weapons systems. The thing's been war-gamed minutely and several times. If there is another war on the Korean Peninsula...
Mr. Hitchens, the question is, do you favor, in effect, regime change in North Korea?
Oh, well, does anyone think I haven't answered that question? Rather mixed response.
I do.
Yes, no, I certainly do, but I'm saying it cannot be brought about by military intervention because it's been war-gamed. Another war on the Korean Peninsula, however it begins...
I think the question...
or rather, however it ends, will begin with the destruction of the city of Seoul.
The question,
which is considered
it seemed
too
to
high
me, was
priced.
really about whether, indeed, given the administration's statement about weapons of mass destruction and about the axis of evil, whether, indeed, they weren't being remarkably inconsistent in calling the North Korea situation now not a crisis and keeping it off the front page and turning determinatively to Iraq. I agree with Christopher that you cannot attack North Korea militarily. The risks are too great, mainly because, not only because they have probably a couple of nuclear weapons, but they also it's mainly because of their conventional forces, as he suggests. I think it is worth adding, though, that the rhetoric, we're a year now on from the axis of evil speech, in which essentially the idea of attacking Iraq was introduced in the State of the Union address by President Bush. During that time, the North Korean situation has declined precipitously, and as inspectors in that time have moved into Iraq and troops have surrounded the country, inspectors have been thrown out of North Korea. It has withdrawn from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nuclear material that was under seal and under observation has been taken out. We don't really know what has happened to it. It could be right now being formed into nuclear weapons. The country has probably the capability of producing a half dozen or so a year. And the Bush administration has presided over an ideologically fueled disaster on the Korean Peninsula, largely because of their aggressive language, because they seem to have thought they could deal with this problem by yelling about and denouncing Kim Jong-il and not dealing with it diplomatically. That strikes me as a much more dangerous to the U.S. interests, dangerous to our allies, situation that we're essentially keeping on the back burner. Indeed, we found out about the uranium program that was started there in October, and it was kept from Americans for a period of weeks while the congressional vote on Iraq went on.
Mark,
while
let's
the debate
now
went on.
have a quick, I yield 30 seconds to Hitchens to reply.
Listen, I urge you, listen to Mr. Tanner. North Korea threw out the inspectors, resumed production, put the uranium rods back in to the reactors. Did this under an inspection regime. Not a very high vote of confidence in the ability of inspectors to stop proliferation.
That's a ridiculous point. They pulled out of the inspection regime. They pulled out of the inspection regime.
Yes, they pulled
That's
out.
an absolutely ridiculous argument.
I said
Let's take turns.
Stop it. Wait, no, I'm sorry. I didn't, that wasn't 30 seconds.
The nuclear material was contained for a half dozen years.
Mark, let
Excuse me.
Hitchens have his 30 seconds.
If I began by saying they threw out the inspectors, it seems to be otiose of you to say that they also withdrew from the inspection regime. I'm sorry. This was all done, this absolute violation of what had been an inspection regime, all done under no military threat of any kind from the United States, and it was a process that was begun during the so-called sunshine diplomacy of a man I consider to be a great man, President Kim Dae-jung. All the time that every inducement and every kindness was being shown towards the Kim Jong-il regime, this process was going on that's now just been consummated. It seems to me exactly to argue against the reliance upon trust, upon inspection, or upon verification.
All right, so
These
please,
things
Hitchens-
all exist at the whim of one-party madmen who can negate them at any moment. And we
This
no
is-
longer wish to live at their whim.
This is
Mark,
a ridiculous...
very brief reply. I want to move on to other questions.
Look, this is a ridiculous argument. The fact is that the regime in place kept this nuclear material under observation for, 8 years? And it worked. It worked. To say that because you can...
What
say
worked?
that
The
because
nuclear
you can
materials
throw
work.
out... To say that because you throw out inspectors, that proves that the inspection regime can't work, is to say that the non-proliferation treaty itself simply doesn't work.
Doesn't
and
work with
without the
dictators.
non-proliferation treaty, we would have nuclear regimes
Doesn't
all
work with
over the globe.
megalomaniac one-party states.
Gentlemen, I think that we are going to end this question here because you can go at it backstage afterwards. Let's move on.
Oh, boy.
Why is it proving so hard to build a multilateral coalition behind this war? Mark, let's start with you.
I think a lot of other people think it's a stupid thing to do. It's all very well to sit here and make fun of the French and make fun of the Germans and make fun of very many people. Christopher's done it for years. A lot of other people do it. It's great sport. It's great sport. I've done it myself on occasion. But the fact is that these countries, and also to say, well, their motives have to do with the oil contracts. That's actually why they're acting, as if the United States didn't have similar motives in Iraq. I'm not saying that's their only motive by any means, but obviously there are commercial motives here for all sides. There's no question about that. The fact is that our major allies think this is a foolish thing to do. Why do they think it's a foolish thing to do? Because they think this country, which has been reduced by sanctions, which is much of its territory covered by no-fly zones, which does not present any kind of imminent threat to its neighbors, can be contained indefinitely, and that attacking it and occupying it is foolish and politically will redound to our detriment into the future. That is why it's been hard to assemble a multilateral coalition to oust him. I don't think it's any more difficult than that. I mean, Christopher will talk about, well, the Saudis, they fear democracy next door.
Let's let Christopher talk about whatever he wants to talk about. Hitchens?
I would rather describe what Christopher wants to talk about.
term.
I feel I can do it much more lucidly, really. And show the disadvantages of his arguments more
Mark,
effectively.
hold your peace.
I can't completely accept the grammar of the question because it isn't that hard to assemble an international coalition. The relevant United Nations Security Council resolution was passed unanimously and included the vote of Syria, among others. And the only question now is whether the Iraqi contempt for this resolution, which has been admitted even by the notorious softy, Mr. Blix, will be considered a material breach or not. I don't think an objective person can be of two minds about that. Second, I would draw a distinction between the behavior of Mr. Chirac, who built Saddam Hussein a nuclear reactor a few years ago, knowing what he wanted it for, and who, as I say, is a pimp and on the take and has been all his life. And Herr Schroeder, who has something to deal with in Germany, which I don't mind at all, namely a public opinion that has a very strong tendency to neutralism, even to pacifism, and a great reluctance to have German soldiers outside the borders of Germany. I find I can live with that. And I find that the bit about it I like the best is the only person who ever persuaded the German people that it would be worthwhile sending their soldiers to another country was Joschka Fischer, leader of the Green Party, saying he thought it would be good if German soldiers played a part in the liberation of Kosovo and Bosnia. And under those conditions, German soldiers were sent overseas. It seems to me that the limiting case almost makes the previous case a stronger one. I think I have as good a claim to be a European as some of the people. My father's family comes from Cornwall, and my mother's family comes from what was once Breslau and is now Wrocław in Poland. And I'm a member of the Advisory International Board of the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq, which contains on its letterhead a very large number of former statesmen from Lithuania, Estonia, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Czech Republic, where the preponderance in the countries of the former Warsaw Pact who favored the making an issue of principle of dictatorship and human rights, as well as its inevitable partner, aggression and terrorism, is impressive to see, and a great deal more impressive than the bleatings from Gay Paris.
Let's try another question. If we use force to eliminate a regime we despise, namely Iraq, who else is on the list? Mark?
I can't speak for who else is on the list. I think it's clear that the administration hopes that in some way this will be a lesson to others. It's unclear what kind of lesson will be delivered. It may be a lesson that it is better to have nuclear weapons, as Kim Jong-il does, than to have a program that is aimed toward, at some point, making them. That is, that any regime who is in the sights of the United States or can be thought to be a rogue regime had better get nuclear weapons that can deter a U.S. invasion as quickly as they can. It's interesting the effect in the last year on the North Korean regime, the effect that the administration has had, both by promulgating and including them in this axis of evil, and also by speaking very aggressively to them and suggesting, in effect, that North Korea will be next. They have responded aggressively in their turn, which was not very surprising to most people who know a lot about North Korea. If you read the paper and follow this, you'll see it. And Christopher's characterization, by the way, of recent history, all I can ask is that you read The Two Koreas by Don Oberdorfer or some other book which will give you an account of what actually happened there. It is a much more frightening crisis. But I can't speak for what country might next be on the list.
Hitchens?
Well, I have read the Oberdorfer book, and there is indeed a very chilling passage in there on the day that Mr. Clinton very nearly decided to bomb North Korea and go to war, and on what it would have taken out of both sides for that to happen, including a very large number of American servicemen. But if we are to be absolutely callous about this, which I don't necessarily recommend, North Korea can't really threaten anyone except South Korea at present, and conceivably, very improbably, Japan. It does raise the threat, not that the fatuous one, I'm sorry to call it, that you raised, that any country with a quarrel with the United States would now think better have a nuclear weapon before we quarrel with them. That's not the problem at all. It does raise the threat that Japan would renounce its anti-nuclear constitution if faced by North Korean nuclear weapons. So there would then be a triangle of nuclear powers in the area, China, North Korea, and Japan. That would be very destabilizing.
And Taiwan, perhaps.
And Taiwan, conceivably, too. That's much worse. Most intriguing to me was the help that North Korea got from Pakistan in developing its program, trading missiles to so on. Because obviously the thing that was wrong with the axis of evil speech was not the two main states that it did mention, which the president got exactly right, North Korea and Iraq, but the one that it mentioned wrongly, Iran, which is in transition to democracy. And by the way, if you consult the Iranian street, you'll find they're all solidly in favor of regime change in Iraq next door, and looking forward to it as an ally in their own struggle for transformation. That's why people don't say Iranian street, you notice, though there are quite a lot of Iranians. And second, because it shows an unwillingness on the part of the president to name the two countries that really were behind al-Qaeda, the two regimes that were, the Saudi Arabian oligarchy and the Pakistani secret police, ISI.
All right. What I think we'll do here by way of conclusion, with your permissions, is give each of you 2 minutes to make a summation of your thoughts about the other's position.
Those are the only questions we're going to get from the House.
Well, time's winged chariot is drawing nigh, and we must end.
All right, is everybody eager to go? Why don't we ask a few more questions?
All right. All right, well, let's ask 2 more questions, if everybody is eager to stay. The president was contemptuous about nation building. We are up to our neck in nation building in Afghanistan, and if we enter Iraq, we will be over our head in nation building. Comments?
Okay, if Afghanistan, the nation building isn't going as well as it might, but I gave some reasons earlier. No,
how did you like the play,
when I'm
Mrs.
trying to be
Lincoln?
funny, you'll know, okay? Then laugh. As I said, 1.5 million Afghans have returned to their country. An enormous humanitarian crisis was averted. And though it isn't true of all of the 50% of Afghans who are female, that they've been emancipated from the worst kind of totalitarianism, it's true of quite a large and encouraging and growing number of them. And furthermore, and again, one need not be callous, but one must be blunt, Afghanistan can't threaten us anymore. That's taken care of. There will be no host regime for any successor gang. That's not bad. The definition of warlord is someone who controls a piece of road and can make use of it for private purposes. Obviously, it would be good if the US Army Corps of Engineers was building an autobahn system in Afghanistan and helping to train an Afghan national army. Both of those projects could be described as underdeveloped at the moment, but they're going okay. The thing is, Afghanistan has nothing with which to pay for this. It's a mendicant, it's a mendicant country, whereas Iraq is potentially, and when removed, emancipated from beggary and exploitation, will be able to pay for itself and its reconstitution. And it has, unless people want to treat the Iraqi people with such condescension as to imagine they have no ideas about their own self-governance, an enormous pool of talented, educated, and qualified people upon which to draw. So to try and say that you can't help both the Afghans and the Iraqis at the same time, I think, is to use them against each other in quite a shameful way, and also to avoid what we're really talking about, which is how likely is it that we can simply disengage from Iraq at this point? Who honestly thinks that a disengagement policy with Iraq is a feasible thing?
The question had to do with nation building. The question
so
is,
it is the answer,
whether in Iraq, I think there's obviously a glass half full, glass half empty problem here. The country indeed is in some ways better off. On the other hand, there are pockets of al-Qaeda around the country. Mullah Omar is still at large. Warlords control most of the country outside of Kabul. The U.S. has opposed military forces, using its own military forces, or in fact those of its allies outside the capital, and has been very, very chary about rebuilding. The situation there is not good. I do agree with Christopher that that isn't perhaps necessarily an argument to use about Afghanistan. It does, Iraq. It does suggest that the United States has a relatively limited attention span. And also that this administration, which came to power very, as the questioner implies, very, very suspicious about nation building, highly critical of the Clinton administration's efforts in Kosovo and Bosnia, for example, which it called foreign policy as social work, indeed does not support long-term occupations and rebuilding of countries. It doesn't believe military forces should be used to do that. Finally, we have a lot of experience in the realm of so-called building democracies. We tried to do it throughout the 20s, throughout the Caribbean, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba. These are places we occupied and supposedly tried to build democracies. Haiti comes up, of course, as a more recent example. It is not that easy to do. Napoleon had a line, you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. He meant by that to rule and create a political order using military force is damnably difficult. And when you have the immense shadow of your own nationalism, the nationalism that your own presence incites in front of you, clouding your vision, it's damnably difficult. And nation building is something that I don't trust this administration to do or trust that it wants to do.
Well, I will just have to say
briefly,
that it seemed to me that the United States was intervening in favor of oligarchy in Central America in those days, not in favor of democracy. It was trying to build and succeeded in building dictatorship in the region, which is quite easy to do, or relatively easy. It doesn't last for very long. I repeat, we're talking about this as if by taking thought or uttering words, we can seize power. The question I keep trying to face people with is this: who imagines that the task of rescuing and recuperating a maimed and bleeding Iraq is not going to come to us whatever we do? Now, someone who says it's not going to, if only Bush would shut up or stop talking about his father, that won't happen, is welcome to think so. But I wouldn't really trust anyone who'd have thought about it only that far. So the question is, in what way will we be helping Iraq to recover itself? In what way will we be helping its society, its industry, and its people to recover? The option of not doing this does not exist.
That's not true.
Last question. What do each of you think will happen in the next few weeks? Mark?
The president seems quite determined to go forward with this war. You saw his determination again tonight in a very eloquent speech that he delivered to a joint session of Congress. On the other hand, I would say that one of the lines he used, which is, if Saddam Hussein does not disarm, we will lead a coalition to disarm him. That phrase, we will lead a coalition, comes essentially from you. That is, it is a response to public opinion polls and other indications on the part of the American people of hesitation, of skepticism about this war. And that kind of hesitation, skepticism, apprehension has caused this administration to alter its policy. The Americans seem to be increasingly apprehensive when they see that the difficulties with the United Nations and with our allies. That has, to some degree, moderated the policy thus far and may indeed continue to do so. It's possible. But at present, it seems to me, the administration is determined to have its war. But I say that hesitantly because I feel as we gather in this town meeting, and after the other town meeting in Washington earlier tonight, we should realize that we're doing something important, that what you think matters and is being taken into account by the administration. And so discussing this, it seems to me, and continuing to discuss it, is doubly important. And I hope we'll keep doing that. And the fact that I say that I think war will happen should not make us fatalistic and should not make us slack in debating this and debating the reasons for it, the way we've done tonight and the way I hope we'll do in the future.
Hitchens.
Well, I can certainly second that. I already said, I think, that the we in the rubric of this evening's discussion is ourselves as well as the United States, and everyone should decide how they would vote themselves if they were to be a delegate at the United Nations, not how they would vote once they knew everyone else was going to vote. Now, you were right earlier when you said that the Bush administration came into power skeptical of nation building. And you would have been even more right if you'd said that many of them, well, as you added, that they'd been skeptical of previous interventions to rescue or recuperate Bosnia and Kosovo. You would have been even righter to say that the oil industry types who are well known to be close to the administration made as their first demand in respect of Iraq that the sanctions be lifted and that normal business be resumed because the United States was being cheated of so much trade in the region. And President Bush, furthermore, made a speech in which he said that he doubted the wisdom of indefinitely continuing the no-fly zones over Iraq. I think those points, some of them made by you, and all of them factually verifiable, are enough in themselves to disprove the facile remarks that one hears so often about the drive to war, the drumbeat of war, the insistence upon war. None of this is at all the case. The Bush administration came into power hoping to conciliate the Iraqi regime and hoping for a quiet life in the Middle East and business as usual. It's taken quite a lot to change its mind. The big change is this. We know that the enemies of our civilization and of Arab and Muslim civilization have emerged from what is actually a root cause, even if root causes are not supposed to be allowed. The root cause is the political slum of client states from Saudi Arabia through Iraq, Pakistan, and elsewhere that has been allowed to dominate the region under United States patronage and use its people and resources as if they were a gas station with a few fly-blown attendants. To the extent that this policy, this mentality has now changed in the administration, to the extent that their review of that is sincere and the conclusions that they draw from it are sincere, I think that should be welcomed. It's a big improvement to be intervening in Iraq against Saddam Hussein instead of in his favor. I think it makes a nice change. It's a regime change for us too. Now you say, what do I think is going to happen? Well, I've been in London and Washington a lot lately, where the debate on this is the hottest. And all I can tell you is that the spokesmen for Mr. Blair and Mr. Bush walk around with a look of extraordinary confidence on their faces. as if they know something that, when disclosed, will dissolve the doubts, the informational doubts, at any rate, of people who wonder if there's enough evidence. Of course, I know
Amazing
perfectly.
they've been able to keep it to themselves for so long.
Well, I have an answer for that too. I have an answer for
But
that
I'm glad
too.
of their confidence anyway.
Good. Well, no, I simply say that, well, I have two reasons for confidence. I was just going to add, though, that I know perfectly well that there are many people who would not be persuaded by this evidence even if it was dumped on their own doorstep, because the same people, many of the same people, didn't believe that it was worth fighting in Afghanistan, even though the connection between the Taliban and al-Qaeda was as clear as could possibly be. So I know that there's a strong faction of the so-called peace movement that is immune to evidence and also incapable of self-criticism, of imagining what these countries would be like if the advice of the peaceniks had been followed. But don't tempt me. I also have made some inquiries.
I'm not sure who you're talking about.
I've also made some inquiries of my own, and I think I know what some of these disclosures will be. But as a matter of fact, I think we know enough. And what will happen will be this. The president will give an order. There will then occur in Iraq a show of military force like nothing probably the world has ever seen. It will be enough, and it will be rapid and accurate and dazzling enough and overwhelming enough to deal with an army or a country many times the size of Iraq, even if that country possessed, what Iraq does not, armed forces and a command structure willing to obey and be the last to die for the supreme leader. And that will be greeted by the majority of Iraqi people and Kurdish people as a moment of emancipation, which it will be a pleasure to see. And then the hard work of the reconstitution of Iraqi society and the repayment of our debt, some part of our debt to them, can begin. And I say, bring it on.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both, and I want to thank all of you for coming. Also would like to thank the Commonwealth Club and the Chancellor's Office. We'll hope we'll see you soon.
Thank you.